Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet. This is my post-season How Did They Stack Up series, and today we will be speaking about how Aston Martin stacked up. How did they stack up against my preseason predictions? How did they stack up against my in-season ratings? And how did each driver stack up against the drivers around them at the end of the season? So, we will start with this nice little graph here that shows that Aston Martin ended up officially in the constructor standing in 5th position. And where did I have them in my preseason prediction? I had them in 4th. So not a little bit bad, but not really great either, in the sense that I had them marked a little bit higher in the ranking than they ended up. They struggled at the end of the season. They started off really strong and kind of tailored off throughout the season, where they couldn't quite keep that ground that they had at the beginning to really push forward. So that kind of struck them a little bit off from my preseason predictions in that going through this season. That I think that preseason testing really had me going for them a lot more than it ended up in this run. So in my in-season rating, I had them in 5th, so that kind of matches up with their official ranking of 5th. And how did I come up with that in-season rating? I took each driver and rated them from 1 to 10 on each race that they performed in. And then I took the average of those scores and gave it to the team. So Aston Martin ended up with a score of 6.59, which put them into that 5th position for my in-season rating. So where did Lance Stroll end up? Officially, he ended up in that 10th position for the driver's standing. And where did I have him predicted in my preseason? 11th. So he did a little bit better than my preseason rating was, but not too far off on that mark. And of course, my in-season rating was way below that with 17. I had not had him rated quite so well throughout the season. He seemed to have quite a few mistakes that kind of pushed him back in my rating systems throughout each weekend. So didn't do so good on my in-season ratings comparative to what he ended up officially into that 10th position. His score was 5.89 overall. And where did his teammate end up overall? That was Fernando Alonso, who officially ended the Drivers' Championship in 4th. My preseason prediction had him in 6th, so he did a couple positions better than my preseason prediction, which is good to see. But I was kind of off on that mark quite a bit. And if you look at those two positions, I didn't think he was going to quite make it up to that standing. And then my in-season rating was 4th, so that aligned with how his official standing was, with a good, nice rating of 7.30. So that put him in 4th position. So in this regard, I think Fernando kind of outshined his teammate for the most part, and we'll probably see that in the graphs comparing the two drivers here in this run. So we have Lance Stroll in blue, and we have red where Fernando Alonso is. And basically this is a graph of every race this season and where they ended up in the final standings. So the lower on this graph, the better, because that's closer to that first position that you want to be in. And of course, that mid mark right there, that 10th position, is anything below that is there, and below gets official driver's standing points. So that's where you want to end up, if at all possible. Anything above that just is more for ties to figure out where people line up, so it's not quite as important. That 10th line is where you want. And of course, the two trend lines here, you have going kind of worse. Both of those, except for Fernando, is getting much worse than Lance Stroll, which is kind of interesting to see that Lance Stroll was able to, at the end, not lose as much ground overall. Whether that was because of his driving preferences or if he was just didn't have quite as much to lose throughout the season. Comparatively, I don't know. I think it's more like Fernando was able to get the most out of that car, and then as it didn't quite develop, he was losing more ground to the people at the head of the pack as they were really pushing him a lot harder in this regard. More comparative to just doing a direct comparison to his teammate directly over the full season. But if you look at all this overall, you can see that, Fernando Alonso started off the season fairly consistently, in that, fourth or fifth position straight across to almost a third of the season. And then he started tailoring off and having more ups and downs at the end of the season, having a little more struggling in that Aston Martin, but still gaining some valuable points through most of the season, if not all of the season, except for those couple of races in the U.S. and Mexico. So if you compare to how many points you're gaining compared to your teammate, Fernando kind of outshined his teammate in this regard, even though his teammate had a better overall trend line throughout the whole season than his teammate Fernando Alonso. But I think Fernando, of course, is easily seen as the better driver of the two pairs for the Aston Martin team itself. And I think once Lance Stroll had a better grip, he started coming back at the end, being closer to his teammate. So hopefully Lance Stroll will have that confidence and have the ability to kind of match his teammate a little bit closer this next season than he did this season, which would give Aston Martin the advantage on those constructors' points in this season. So each driver, how did they compare? So here we see Lance Stroll in that 10th position compared to Pierre Gasly, which was right behind him in red. And then Oscar Piastri in 9th, just ahead of him. So this is kind of looks like quite a big mess here. So it's the same kind of graph as we saw the two teammates together. But we see a lot more ups and downs throughout this pairing of drivers. So we see basically the trend lines here. Lance Stroll getting worse because, going up is bad, where Oscar Piastri was gaining ground significantly throughout the season, where that McLaren started off the season in horrible conditions, and they knew that, and they kind of switched gears really early on and came out strong near the end of the season, which turned their whole season around significantly. So you kind of see that in his trend line and how well it was doing. And then, of course, we see Pierre Gasly, which is closer to, it's getting slightly better, but is closer to a steady line in that red line across the board. So here you can potentially take off, if you want to be generous, all the bad positions like the 20th and around that, because that's probably either vehicle issues or potential collisions that cause the car to be retired in some form or fashion. Now, you could argue that part of that is due to where the driver ended up and being able to avoid those collisions, so you needed to include them. And that's kind of why I included them here, just to give you the full picture of everything. And of course, the dips at the going down are where they were shining and were doing really well in this each race. So you have the big ups and big downs for each driver throughout this, especially you can look at Oscar Piastri and Pierre Gasly. They have a lot more ups and downs than Lance Stroll through most of this season. So you have to see how that works out. I mean, Lance Stroll had some struggles at the, in that midsection more than the rest of them in general, where they had a couple of races going bad. And then, of course, had that couple of races that he was out for the season as well. But this kind of gives you an idea of how well they compared to the people around them at the end of the season, and how, for each race and comparatively how they kind of shine throughout the season, and how if they kind of matched each other or if there were some more significant issues here. So it's kind of a hot mess in this view, but you can get some information out of it nonetheless. So if we look at Fernando Alonso here in this graph, we see much more condensed at the bottom with a few issues with Charles Leclerc, who was in fifth, having some struggles at the beginning of the season and a couple of issues throughout the regular season as well. Then you have Fernando, who was kind of started off really well and slowly got worse as the season came on, except for the last couple of races. He started getting back into the norm where he was closer at. So where did Lewis Hamilton come? He was just the same, except for a couple of races where he had some issues in that like United States, Qatar range. So that kind of distorted his view a little bit in that regard. But overall, I think he was doing a much better job, and you can see that with the points running as well. But I think Fernando Alonso is doing fairly well at the beginning to gain the points, to keep him into the running and keep him into that chance of getting into that third position until that mid-season where he kind of started dropping off significantly in that Aston Martin, where they started struggling, where the other people developed their vehicles a little bit better than Aston Martin was able to do throughout the season. So you can see the trend lines here, where Charles Leclerc was getting much better throughout the season, even though he had quite a few offs, downsides in that regard. And you see Fernando Alonso is getting the worst out of this trend line, line up throughout the season. And Lewis Hamilton was getting worse as well, but not quite as fast as Fernando. So, in that regard, I think that's what kind of helped Lewis stay ahead of Fernando in this running. So, how did the actual teams line up? You can see here the graph for every race and what kind of points each team scored on each race. And you can kind of look at those trend lines. And so you can see McLaren with a significant increase throughout the season, really gaining ground at the end, who was in fourth, just ahead of Aston Martin. Aston Martin decreasing slightly throughout, or quite a bit, I guess, in this season, starting off strong and not ending the season as near as strong as they started the season with. If they could have maintained that, they would have probably easily had that fourth position and maybe that third position overall, where Alpine in that sixth position was pretty steady, but just kind of far behind, not gaining the points that teams ahead of them were getting throughout this season. So this is pretty much a nice graph just to show trend lines throughout the season and kind of give you a big picture of how the teams were scoring points across the season as well. So if you look at the step graph now of points across the season, you can kind of see that, Alpine started off decently according to McLaren, with Aston Martin doing a better job overall in that mid first part of the season, almost all the way 2/3 of that season before crossing the line with McLaren. Now, but you can really see that, midway through the season, they basically stalled out and started becoming more flat in this run across the season for points, whereas McLaren really picked up that mid-season and started just scoring quite a bit. So they overtook Alpine and was able to even at the end of the season overtake Aston Martin in the point standings for the Constructors' Championship. So Aston Martin has a lot to do over the break to really figure out why they were struggling at the end of the season, why their updates didn't perform the way they were thinking they were going to perform when they brought them near that mid-season and in-season runnings to really gain ground. So they need a lot of work to try to figure out how that really car was performing So hopefully they can develop that car to gain that ground to really help out that team throughout this season and hopefully into the next season, in that 2024 season, to really keep that competitiveness, to really, put pressure on to potentially get the 4th or even 3rd position in the constructors standings. So you'll have to really kind of put a lot of work in that to really understand what's going on with the tweaks that they're making on that car. So what's coming up next? We have how did McLaren stack up? And so if you made it this far, I'd appreciate a like on this video. And if you would like to see my McLaren stack up video, I'd appreciate a subscribe as well. And until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.